Hey, this is Dogger's Lab, and in this video I'm going to be showing how I extracted and refined pure gold from 1 pound of gold-plated pins recovered from various electronic waste components. This is a fairly straightforward procedure. It just kind of takes a long time, and the amount of time it takes can vary depending on what type of pins you're dealing with. But you're going to want to get an oxygen supply, and you're going to want to bury it underneath the pins, and then you're going to want to pour muriatic acid in until you cover the surface of the pins, and for me that was roughly 1,000 milliliters. And then you're just going to want to add about 100 to 200 milliliters of topical grade hydrogen peroxide, or 3% hydrogen peroxide, and you're just going to want to give that some time to work. Now this all came from a client, so I actually forgot to add his gold-plated fingers, so I did that a few hours later. So I was also processing some plastic IC sockets and some gold-plated transistors for the client in a separate beaker. And this is them here. So after about 24 hours, for pins like this, I like to add a piece of copper of some sort, and the client already had a piece that had some gold-plated pin ends attached to it. So I threw that in there to facilitate the generation of copper chloride. After a few days, I started noticing a silvery base metal buildup at the bottom, so I stirred it up pretty good, and I added a little bit of hydrochloric acid to help dissolve it. And after about a week, I decided to filter it for the first time. And I'll just show how I set this filter up the first time. I use a fine micron circular filter at the bottom, and then I just use a standard basket coffee filter on the top. So I give it a good stir just to get things kind of moving around in there. So when you're pouring this chloride solution, or this acid peroxide solution, it's going to have a tendency to block up your filter paper and slow down the pouring process. So you can just add a little bit of muriatic acid to the top there, and it should dissolve some of the base metals and let the liquid come through. And I try to reuse the solution as much as I can before getting the rest of the metals out later on. So I just pour the solution right back into the original beaker. And if more base metals start to build up at the bottom, then I'll repeat this same process, and I'll separate the solution from the base metals that get stuck in the filter, and then I'll pour muriatic acid into the top of the filter to dissolve them. They'll fall down into the bottom of the filter beaker, and then I'll take that and separate that, and then you can return the original solution back into the original beaker. And every time I pour, I like to shake it in a circular motion like this. It seems best to get the gold foils floating around freely. And then a slight rocking back and forth motion can kind of slingshot those gold foils back forward. Otherwise they tend to be, pretty heavy, so they start to slide downhill pretty fast. right here you can see that the filter's acting like it's blocked up a little bit. So right here I decided to pour in the muriatic acid and try and free that filter up of some of the base metal chlorides. Every few pours it'll start to slow down again, and you just repeat the process. And right here is what happens if you don't do this often enough. Those are base metals that have dropped out onto the copper, and it will no longer allow the copper to dissolve. So we have to increase the ratio of hydrochloric acid to dissolve those base metals first. And look, after just a couple of minutes of sitting there, it just turned black like motor oil. So then I filtered this. So at this point, the solution that's in my vacuum beaker has had all of the gold foils removed from it, and it's full of base metal chlorides, so now I'm going to make a new solution. So I add fresh muriatic acid and fresh hydrogen peroxide and reinsert my oxygen supply, and the next time I go to pour this solution, it should be a lot cleaner on my filter. You can see there's still a lot of gold foils floating around in there, but it's not imperative that I collect them right at this second. Meanwhile, our filter in our old solution is almost done passing through to reveal all the gold foils that we just collected from our first filter pour. And I just pull that filter up. It'll have the largest foils in it. And then you take the fine filter from the bottom and you roll that up into a ball, because it'll have the finest foil particles in it. And try to wipe up any dust if there is any at the bottom of the Buchanan funnel. And then you throw that into your beaker for later. And a few days later, I filtered the newly dissolved solution. And as you'll see, it was much cleaner this time. Look at that. Sorry, I wish I had a better angle. I'll work on that. So after pouring that solution back into the beaker, you swish that around and pour that into the filter. And try and collect as much as you can before you ball that up and put it in your beaker for later. This is at like 4 times speed, by the way. Look at that filter at the end. So this time you can see there's a lot more fine particles attached to that filter at the bottom. At this point it would be a good idea to pour that solution back into the original beaker and filter it a few more times, so that's what I do. Yeah, just a little bit of fresh hydrogen peroxide to rejuvenate the oxygenation power of the solution. This is like week 3. Starting to get a gunky filter, so I add a little bit of muriatic acid. This time I turned off the pump and just let it drip through. Once it started to pour through a little bit better, I just decided to add more solution. And it seemed like it was pouring through fine at that point. So here you can see I'm starting to get less out of each pour from our original beaker of pins. And off camera I use a little bit of muriatic acid and then I wash it with water to clean this filter out. Here you can see there's still some plating left on those bigger pins. But these are our IC sockets and transistors, and they're starting to float around, which means they are loose. They are ready to pour. So there's our filter that I cleaned out, and now I'm pouring in the transistors and the plastic IC sockets. So after I poured that solution out of the beaker with the transistors and IC sockets, I added the transistors and IC sockets to the beaker that had the pins in it, and then I waited a few days, and then I filtered it again. So at this point, the large gold pins have come clean of all of their gold, and those large circular gold pieces that you see in the filter are from the transistors. And that was the final filter. So now all of this is ready for refinement. So to make Aqua Regia, we're going to add 500 milliliters of distilled water. And then I add about 200 milliliters of muriatic acid. And then you're going to want to apply some heat. Now I'm going to add just a splash of sulfuric acid to help precipitate any lead that might be in solution and to help dissolve those filter papers a little bit. And I give it a little shake. Then I walk away to change my gloves and let that solution heat up a little bit. Then you're going to want to add somewhere between 5 and 10 milliliters of nitric acid. So after a few minutes of boiling, you can see some of the gold foils are starting to make their way out of the filters and the solution is starting to turn green. And after about 25 minutes, the filters started to break up pretty well. You can see they start to turn kind of mushy. And at this point, I decided it was time to pour it through because all the gold was dissolved. Unfortunately, my camera ran out of storage, so I can't really take that clip back, but here's the aftermath. Anyways, once you've got your clear solution into the bottom of your beaker, you add that to a different beaker, and then I add urea nitrate to neutralize the nitric acid. And in the background, I was preparing a solution of sodium metabisulfite. And once you're confident that the nitric acid has been substantially neutralized, you can go ahead and pour in your solution or just powder of sodium metabisulfite. And that darkening color is the gold falling out of solution. So it was getting pretty late at this point, so I just let it sit overnight. And when I came back, it was all nice and neatly settled at the bottom. So then we're gonna pour our solution through the filter and try to catch any gold particles that might start floating around as we pour our solution off. This same filter paper I will actually use to put the dry gold powder in when I go to melt it. And by doing that, I can kind of ensure that none of that gold powder will fly out of the crucible when I start my torch up. This also makes it easier to combine the gold that you catch in these filters during this process with the gold that you actually recovered and dried. And this is the gold that was remaining at the bottom of the beaker. So now I just got a little squirt bottle with distilled water in it, and I'm gonna clean the edges of the beaker off. Trying to make sure there's no residual sodium metabisulfite or nitric acid or urea or gold particles or anything on that beaker. And then after that is settled and you pour that liquid into your filter that we just used, and we'll add some hydrochloric acid, and we'll moderately heat this, probably right below boiling. And that's the water from the distilled water wash. This is after a couple of minutes of cooking in the hydrochloric acid. It's nasty stuff, you don't want to breathe it in. And then we're just going to pour that solution in through that same exact filter. So the high concentration of hydrochloric acid here at the end will again pull contaminants out of the filter up there and down into the bottom of the beaker. And after I get a weight on our gold, whatever it might be, I'll split it, but I'll split it kind of heavy on one blob because the top filter is going to have less gold than the bottom filter, and I'll put the bigger amount of gold into that top filter, and then I'll melt that in the crucible, And then the smaller amount of gold I'll pour into the bottom filter, which has more gold stuck in it, and it should be about even. After we've washed our gold with hot hydrochloric acid, you have to wash it with fresh distilled water a couple of times. And this is after a couple of minutes of heating. After about an hour on the heater, it was finally dry enough to where it unstuck from the bottom of the beaker. So I zeroed my scale on a tiny little beaker, and then I added the gold in, and it came out to 1.91 grams. Then I split it, put the larger one into the top filter, like I said. And then I like to preheat my crucible. Just let it sit for a few minutes, and then I add some borax in. That way my gold has something to kind of float around in without getting stuck to the bottom of the crucible. So I stuck the filter to the borax, and then I started melting it. Add a little bit of borax to help the gold flow into the middle. This is like 4 times speed right now. You can see there's a piece of that filter that doesn't want to burn up entirely. It's hard to catch on camera, but you can kind of see there was a pretty nice bead forming in the middle there. Apologies for the visual clutter. This is not my garage. Now, right as the gold bead is cooling, you need to pour the borax onto it. That'll cause your gold blob to harden. Then you can cool it in some water. Voila! A nice little gold bead. Second one is the same deal, except the smaller amount of gold I poured into the bottom filter, which was packed with more gold. And whichever one is smaller, I agreed I would take it. Just trying to rock it back and forth enough to where those little tiny beads that you probably can't see will eventually touch and become one blob, and doing it over and over and over again until pretty sure I got all the gold. Pretty much summarizes how you do this. There's like a little tiny bead stuck up there that won't roll down. And sadly, that's about all my camera storage could handle, so I cut the video a little short. But once again, you just sprinkle that borax on right as it's starting to lose its redness. I'm trying to hurry up so it doesn't stick to the crucible. And there you have it. Then you just clean that flux off using boiling sulfuric acid. Again, you do not want to breathe this stuff in. I don't suggest you do it around electronics either. One gram. And 0.97 grams. Looks like that one's mine. Well, thanks for watching, guys.